Pro Football Focus, Week 14, Chalk Talk podcast. I'm Scott Barrett, joined, as always, by Tyler Buecher. Tyler, we don't need no fancy schmancy introductions. Let's just dive right into the good stuff and look at the Week 14 main slate on both DraftKings and FanDuel. Just a quick note that Sunday Night Football is not going to be on either slate this week. That's a little disappointing. Maybe a lot to like on Pittsburgh's side of the ball against Baltimore, but that's not going to be in consideration for us this week. Tyler, how's it going? You want to start us off with some quarterbacks you like?
Yeah, Week 14, man. We're chugging right along on the regular season. It's flying by. This week looks a little kind of wide open, to be honest, as far as the quarterback position. I think there's a lot of different ways we can go here. In cash games, the one guy that immediately stood out to me was Blaine Gabbert. I think he's priced way too low at $4,800 on DraftKings. This is a matchup here where he's playing at home against the worst 8-14 that I can remember in the Tennessee Titans. They just allowed over 20 fantasy points to Tom Savage last week, for crying out loud. In his 3 starts since taking over, Gabbert has thrown for 6 total touchdowns, averaging 17.7 fantasy points per outing. That's easy 3x cash game value for him there. He also has his best receiver, Larry Fitzgerald, in a very good matchup here with slot cornerback Logan Ryan suffering a concussion. He's very questionable for this matchup. Doesn't look like he may play. If he were to be benched, I think Fitzgerald has a chance to just go completely off here. And no defense has allowed more pass completions than the Titans this season. Tennessee also ranks top 10 in most passing yards, most passing touchdowns. There's just so many different avenues here for Gabbert to score fantasy points. And at a sub 5K cost, I think he's a screaming value here for cash game consideration.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people on that call this week. I think I like it, but I'm not sure if I like it as much as Jimmy Garoppolo in a seemingly smash spot against Houston. That's been a defense we've been targeting all season with quarterbacks. They rank dead last in fantasy points allowed per dropback, second worst in fantasy points allowed over their expectation. And Garoppolo looked good. He looked nice last week. He didn't throw for any touchdowns, but he did throw for 293 yards against Chicago last week. Tyler, any interest in Garoppolo?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense there. I also really like the idea of pairing him with Marquise Goodwin. Goodwin's just been tearing it up ever since the last couple weeks. I think Garoppolo makes for a very strong play, 5,500 on DK. I like that call a lot. Who else are you looking at the quarterback position this week?
You got to look at Alex Smith, and I know it's going to feel like chasing points after he just scored the most fantasy points of any quarterback in any week this season last week. But if you throw out Geno Smith and Paxton Lynch, who have no business starting in the NFL, then Oakland ranks second worst this past decade in opposing passer rating. Really horrific pass defense. And maybe it's not point chasing. You do have the new offensive play caller coming in. Though I'd like to see if someone do a study, maybe I will. I feel like there's usually like a big letdown from an offensive play caller's first game to a second game, but I don't know. That's just a random narrative that might be false. You could play Derek Carr on the other side too. Kansas City ranks 5th worst over expectation this season, but the Chiefs have been way better at home. I think it's 11 straight home games allowing 20 points or less. I think I saw Evan Silva tweet that out. But yeah, I like Alex Smith quite a bit. Any interest for you, Tyler?
Yeah, I think he's a strong play, and I don't really think it's point chasing here considering the matchup against Oakland. This defense is not very good at defending the pass. I don't think it's chasing at all to go back to Alex Smith. But the one guy I want to go with, staying in this AFC West division, is Phillip Rivers. If I'm playing the GPP, I want a guy with a high upside, and I really think Rivers provides that this week. He's playing at home as a 6-point favorite against the Redskins. Rivers has been on fire lately. He's thrown for multiple touchdowns in 4 of his last 6, with just 2 interceptions during that span. He's thrown 30-plus pass attempts in each one of those outings, and Washington is no stranger to allowing big fantasy outings to opposing quarterbacks. They've allowed over 25 DK points 5 times this season. They're giving up the 7th most fantasy points on the year to the position. The way to attack Washington is through the middle of the field, and it just so happens to coincide with where his best receiver, Keenan Allen, runs the plurality of his routes. I just had to beat you to the word plurality this week. I just love this stack here, Rivers to Keenan Allen. I think it's great for GPPs. There's a lot of savings here at other positions that we can target, and I think you can pay up at other stacks, at other contrarian stacks as well. I don't think salary is a huge concern here, given some of the obvious plays that we'll get to as we go on later throughout this pod.
All right, so this is going to be a little out there, but just hear me out. So no team has cost me more money than the Jets at least in recent weeks. Maybe Kareem Hunt has lost me the most money this year, but the Jets as a team have cost me some money just because I keep neglecting them for whatever reason. But over their last 6 games, the Jets rank first in combined points, so that's points allowed and points scored. So basically their games have just continually gone over their projection. But Denver ranks 5th in combined points. So this kind of could be maybe another sneaky shootout where like every single week the Jets have been in sneaky shootout games. And that's kind of how GPPs are won, is like betting on a game to go over that no one else is on. Josh McCown's in consideration for sure. Trevor Siemian might be one of the worst 3 starting quarterbacks right now in the NFL. Still, the Jets are giving up the most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing quarterbacks. Denver ranks 9th worst over their last 5 games. They ranked 3rd worst this season in opposing passer rating after ranking best in the league last year. Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, super cheap. Any interest on McCown? I think you're going to say yes. And then as a really gross tournament option, Simeon, I'm going to bet you say is not in play. Let's hear it, Tyler.
100%. You nailed it there. So McCown
I want to
was the guy
believe
last week. Like, I had him in cash every single lineup. I had him streaming him in every redraft league I was in. Guy was in a nut spot, and he just completely went off, exceeding even my expectations. But I cannot get behind this Denver passing attack at all. I just took a look at the quarterback wide receiver pairings for to see who had the highest rating when combined. The lowest one with a minimum of 50 targets was Trevor Siemian to Demaryius Thomas. The QB rating when those two target each other is 47.3. Dead last in the league so far. It's just a very atrocious spot to target. Demaryius Thomas saw 10 targets last week. Emmanuel Sanders saw 7, and they combined for, I think it was less than 40 yards combined. It was just gross. I cannot get behind this Denver passing attack. It's going to be a wait and see until we actually see it happen for me, until I decide to roster one of those guys again.
All right. I think that's fair. What about Jameis Winston? So the Detroit Lions rank dead last in fantasy points per game allowed over expectation to opposing quarterbacks over their last 5 weeks. I was just talking about combined points with the Jets and the Broncos. Detroit's first in combined points this season. Jameis Winston, meanwhile, is cheap. He's averaging 295 passing yards, 1.7 passing touchdowns in all games he's attempted over 15 passes this season. It would make sense to run it back with Stafford, some of the wide receivers there, but he is dealing with a badly bruised hand, as is Dak Prescott. But I still like Jameis Winston. DeShone Kizer is another name I think is interesting at his price. Like Simeon, I do not believe in the talent. I think DeShone Kizer probably never starts another game after the season. Maybe that's a hot take. I'm really not sure, but I think that's true. Green Bay is giving up the second most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing quarterbacks over the last 5 weeks. If Josh Gordon is the smash play everyone thinks he is, this is a unique lineup. Maybe not a lot of people are going to be on. I think Brett Hundley is in play too. We've targeted Cleveland all season. It looks like he's improving as a quarterback. Cleveland's third worst over expectation, second worst fantasy points per dropback allowed. Green Bay's eighth, actually. Browns are second worst in opposing passer rating. Green Bay's fifth worst. Any interest in those two quarterbacks and Jameis Winston?
I think Winston's a very good play. He was kind of a guy I was reluctant on to going back to in his first game back last week. It just seemed like a little early to go back to a guy who had spent several weeks on the bench healing up a shoulder injury. But Kaiser and Hundley, I really, really like this week for Josh Gordon. I think he's going to be the highest owned wide receiver of the week. I understand the idea of trying to pair him, but Kaiser has not been very fantasy relevant. He just really hasn't performed up to what we expect. And this Green Bay defense, I think, is actually the way to play it. I think I'll be targeting that instead. Kaiser has just 2 fantasy outings of over 20 fantasy points in his last, I think it's 8 or 9 games. I just don't really see a high ceiling there, despite the Packers secondary being kind of a dreadful. Hundley, man, Hundley's a tough play because we saw last week where he was supposed to be in a great matchup against Tampa Bay. We thought he'd throw for a ton of yards. Didn't do much of anything. He was one of the worst plays of the week. Fell flat in a place where he should have gone off.
84 passing yards, 0 passing touchdowns, 1 interception on 22 attempts. Definitely not good. Somehow he won that game, and also he rushed for 66 yards and 7 carries. I agree these are kind of more bottom barrel, more contrarian plays.
And I won't fight risk. I won't fight you too hard on contrarian plays because if you're trying to game stack it, it makes a ton of sense. If you want to go Kaiser, Gordon, bring it back with Jamal Williams, or find some way to mix and match the certain fantasy relevant players in here, it totally makes sense. We've seen anything can happen in this 2017 NFL season, so I feel like I'd be remiss to just write off it completely.
Anyone else at the quarterback position for you?
No, that's about it. Let's move on to the running back position.
Really quick, I do want to say the Rams-Eagles game looks very interesting to me. I haven't fully analyzed this game yet. Haven't done all of my research yet, but those are 2 guys you want to have in consideration as well. All right, we can move on to the running back position. And before we do, I just want to mention this podcast is being recorded on Wednesday night. So if there's like late news, like Amir Abdullah was out on Sunday, I gained massive exposure to Theo Riddick. Also had exposure to guys like Kerwin Williams. Was borderline all in on Kenyon Drake on FanDuel. So injuries are massive at this position. Really every position, even tight ends too. We saw that Trey Burton week, and it might be another Trey Burton week this week. But really, when a running back goes down, that's a now depleted. The team is now depleted at that position. So the lead running back, whoever that's going to be, maybe they're just a marginal talent, but they're going to see such an increase in opportunity at such a low DFS price tag that those are the kind of the guys I'm always jamming into my lineups, even if it's a gross name, a guy we don't think is very good. But if we can project it to not be a committee situation, this guy's seeing a high percentage of the snaps at a low DFS salary. That's a guy I'm going to go almost all in on. And interestingly enough, we see low ownership on these guys. Maybe people don't want to adjust all their lineups Sunday morning. They don't have the time. They're not staying up to date on everything, or they're just blindly following analysts throughout the week. I don't know, but I typically make a lot of money on those guys. Tyler, anything to add on there?
I couldn't agree more. Being attentive to the news on Sunday morning is imperative if you want to continuously profit in DFS. We saw it last week with Kenyon Drake. He's a guy who we knew earlier in the week that Damian Williams was going to sit out, but Theo Riddick was the play there. I think it was 3,400 complete smash play on DK given the full PPR price. Pivoting to him was a great way to earn a ton of money in week 13. I'm just going to dive right into the most obvious play here at running back for week 14, and that's
Frank Gore.
Giovani Bernard.
Just kidding.
Bernard, 3,100, priced near the minimum. And we're kind of expecting Joe Mixon to sit this one out. Monday Night Football, he suffered a concussion. If he were to sit this game out, Gio becomes a smash play for cash, GPPs, whatever. He's basically a free square. He's going to be in line for a massive number of snaps, touches, anything. And like Scott said, like, we don't really care what the name is as long as we're projecting them for a ton of touches and opportunities. That's what we want here in DFS. The matchup against the Bears here isn't really a layup per se, but I don't know, Kenyon Drake showed us last week that it's difficult to fade players who are locked in for that type of volume. The Bears actually rank toward the middle of the pack in most rushing categories, but the Bengals are playing at home, 6-point favorites. He's a free square, ton of volume. I'm just going to be locking him in. What do you think about Bernard? Is he a lock for you as well?
Yeah, I could see myself going all in on him. It just goes back to what we were saying before. I wrote a little bit about this in my Bell Cow article. I think you just search my name in Bell Cow, and you can see what I've written about this. But yeah, I see him seeing a massive touch share, a massive snap share, and I don't think the matchup's too bad. I believe nose tackle Eddie Goldman, linebacker Pernell McPhee, both are dealing with injuries and are questionable to play, maybe doubtful even. But we've said that before about Chicago dealing with injuries, and they've still been stout. But yeah, it really just comes down to volume. I see him seeing a massive workload, and he's been efficient. Arguably, he's been far better than Mixon this season. But yeah, I'm borderline going all in on him this week.
All right, so we've got the Saints running backs playing Thursday night.
Thank God.
So we've got the Steelers playing Sunday night. We've got the Patriots playing Monday night. We have a lot of the running backs that we've relied on the past few weeks off the main slate this week. Where are you turning to at the running back position this week besides Giovani Bernard?
Honestly, I think this is a week to pay down at running back, and I don't think we've said that for quite a few weeks. But if there is a guy to pay up for, and though he's in a bad matchup, it's Todd Gurley. Because given the volume he's seeing, there's no such thing as a bad matchup for him. Because he's so heavily utilized as a receiver, and he's just been so efficient. He leads all players in fantasy points per game this season. So it makes sense to maybe pay up for him in a few spots. So really, I think the way my lineup concentration is going to be, it's going to be maybe all cheap guys, like all under the top 12 highest priced running backs, or one of those, maybe another in the flex, and a Todd Gurley. And I think that's about it for me. I don't know. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, I'm between Todd Gurley and LaShawn McCoy. If Tyrod sits as expected, I think we should see a ton of Nathan Peterman handoffs to McCoy. Peterman's debut earlier this season shouldn't really make this a choice, but a necessity to feature McCoy heavily against the Colts this week. Indianapolis is allowing the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs, and a major component of that is the receiving work they're yielding to them. The Colts have allowed the 3rd most receiving yards to running backs so far this year, so we should see a ton of Peterman checkdowns to McCoy. I'm not really expecting Peterman to push the ball downfield, given what we've seen, so I'm hoping that McCoy gets a lot of carries and targets downfield. The one thing that's a little concerning is the number of snaps that Travaris Cadet is seeing over the past couple weeks. McCoy is no longer seeing the 20-plus touches routinely that I was super into a few weeks ago.
Good call there, Tyler, with some honest reasoning. So let's talk about some of the cheaper running backs. I am on Seattle's Mike Davis. So he's played in just 2 games this season. In Week 11, he played on less than a quarter of the team's snaps before leaving with an injury, but he still totaled 8.1 expected fantasy points and 7.9 actual fantasy points. In Week 13, he returned to action after a 1-week absence. He totaled 16.8 expected fantasy points and 14.1 actual fantasy points, and that's against the toughest run defense of the league in the Philadelphia Eagles. He played on 73% of the snaps, drew 84% of the carries, and 57% of the team's running back targets. In total, 16 carries, 4 targets, and he saw all of the work inside the 10-yard line. I know this run game has been atrocious all season, but Mike Davis has been good, has looked good, and he's cheap. So I am on that. Jacksonville has been better with Marcel Darius back, but they do rank 4th worst in yards per carry. And we know that this is a brutal pass defense, so I could see Seattle being a little bit more committed to the run game this week. Tyler, your thoughts?
I think it's a strong play considering he's been the most effective running back we've seen since Chris Carson earlier this year. The running back committee that Seattle's been deploying has just been largely ineffective. The only way they've been able to get any rushing productivity is just through Russell Wilson's legs. It's nice and refreshing to see Mike Davis take over and actually perform somewhat. Well, it's actually just surprising to see Mike Davis, first of all, and to see them have effective running. I like that call a lot. Another punt play, well, not really a punt, more of a cheaper surprise play that I'm into is Jay Ajayi. This is going to be just for GPPs here, but I've been trying to figure out how to attack this Rams-Eagles game as well, and it's kind of difficult. So the Rams defense has been tough to throw on this season. They're bottom 10, but they are allowing the most rushing yards to opposing running backs and the 3rd highest yards per carry on the season. It's culminated in them giving up the 2nd most DK points to opposing backs, with them allowing 7 different backs to score at least 22 fantasy points against them. I think Ajayi and even LeGarrette Blount would be a very contrarian play this week. Ajayi would be the guy that I'd prefer, though. He led the backfield in snaps, carries, and targets last week in what was the first real competitive football game for the Eagles in over a month. I'm expecting this one to be another competitive game here with the tough outing against the Rams, and I think the way that the Eagles have success will be attacking the Rams via the ground. Ajayi at 4,500 is a pretty cheap play here for GPPs, and you could see LeGarrette Blount at even cheaper at 3,900.
Definitely risky, but I can see that being how this game shakes out as well. Though, I mean, the Rams are favored in this contest, so who knows. But another cheap running back I am on would be Peyton Barber. If I was confident Doug Martin was out, he practiced on Wednesday, so that's looking unlikely, but he did see a really attractive workload last week. He totaled 18.9 expected fantasy points, 18.3 actual fantasy points, 27 total opportunities. Maybe even if Doug Martin comes back, he's still used as the team's bell cow, but be a risky play, but one I'm at least intrigued in. I was joking before about Frank Gore, but I think he is interesting as a punt play salary saver. I do not have a ton of confidence in this call, but he does get to face the Buffalo Bills defense we've been targeting for a number of weeks now. For the season, they rank 2nd worst in fantasy points per game allowed over expectation. They're giving up the most rushing fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Samaje Perine another guy in that tier for me. So this also carries a significant amount of risk because Washington is just getting destroyed by injuries. Their offensive line is in shambles. Their defense is dealing with injury as well. He flopped last week, but you've seen 23, 24, 12 carries, 2, 4, 3 targets the last 3 weeks. He could get game scripted out. Marshall saw 6 targets and 4 carries last week. Though the matchup is strong, the Chargers rank 2nd worst in yards per carry this season. Any interest in those 3 names, Tyler?
Those are tough, man. So Gore has a very low ceiling.
Right.
He would just be a cash game play for me, which makes sense. I mean, considering the Bills matchup, I think it's a strong play. Perine, I'm worried about game script. I'm projecting the Chargers here to just blow the Redskins out of the water.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, so I mean, Perine's been crushing it when he gets this opportunity, but he only saw 15 touches last week due to the negative game script. I'm worried about that repeating itself this week. And I'm not too excited about Peyton Barber. I think he was a 1-week workhorse. I mean, Doug Martin back in the fold was a full practice participant on Wednesday. I think it kind of narrows the ceiling there for Barber.
I think we need to get clarity on if he's named the starter for him to be in consideration. But yeah, I think you're right there. What are some other names you're looking at, Tyler? I got two more, I think.
Okay, well, speaking of injuries, it's week 14. We're seeing a lot of backfields banged up. We're seeing a lot of teams as a whole banged up. Team I'm looking at is the Houston Texans. So
Yes.
Devonta Foreman, IR. Alfred Blue, concussion. He was the DNP on Wednesday. I think we're in line for a lot of Lamar Miller touches. Newly signed Andre Ellington had just 2 carries last week. He was being used as a receiver instead. They've got a dearth of injuries there that have plagued the position at wideout. Lamar Miller, I think, is in quiet contention here for a massive number of opportunities in Week 14. He's playing against the 49ers defense. They're allowing a ton of fantasy points opposing backfields, and this could be one of the highest-paced games in the league. In fact, both teams rank top 6 in plays per game this season. San Francisco ranks top 5 in most rushing attempts, rushing yards, receptions, receiving yards, and fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. I really, really like Lamar Miller. I think he's a very strong FanDuel play. Just a bit more. He's only had 4 receptions, I think 3 times this season. So it's kind of a ceiling for him there as far as reception upside. But I think he's viable on both sides. He's going to have a ton of volume. It's a plus matchup. Lamar Miller I'm trying to find a way to fade him in cash games, but he's sneakily finding his way into mine.
Yeah, I love that you just gave out a FanDuel take because I know you're a huge DraftKings guy. I'm with you. He was one of the names I wrote up. That one concern, however, is definitely that Andre Ellington's in the mix now. He saw 6 targets last week, and we could see the Texans get game scripted out of contention here. You know I like Jimmy Garoppolo this week. That is what hurt Jordan Howard last week, this game being a little bit closer than I think a lot of people expected. Still, I mean, it's the 49ers we're talking about, so I don't know. But yeah, I'm with you. I like it. I do think it is a little risky, at least. Another name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it could possibly be more of a GPP play now that I think about it a bit more. But I think it's going to be an interesting one to game stack considering how fast the pace is going to be for this game. I think there's a lot of volume projected for DeAndre Hopkins, a lot of volume for Steven Anderson, the tight end that's taking over, doing a lot of receiving work. It could go either way, in San Francisco's way or the Texans. I think there's going to be a lot of plays on both sides to pursue.
If Anderson and Hopkins are held without touchdowns, maybe disappointing days, and Miller goes off, that's a great way to differentiate yourself from the field. I'm with you, but I was also burned by Howard last week, so I'm a little hesitant. But, I mean, this is the defense we've been targeting all season. They ranked dead last in fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing running backs. They've given up the most fantasy points per game to running backs in 3 straight years, just to lead backs over the past 2 seasons. Opponent running backs are averaging more than Ezekiel Elliott has averaged over that stretch. So definitely matchup looks good on paper. Another running back I'm on, and usually whenever this podcast comes out, I'll tweet out the link to my followers. I will not do that this week, just on the off chance that my buddy Evan Silva sees the link, clicks it, listens to this podcast, and hears me talk up this name, because I will never live it down, and that is Rex Burkhead. The last time Rob Gronkowski was out, Amendola had a season-high 8 receptions. James White saw 9 targets, his second highest total this season. I think Burkhead was injured and inactive in that game, but he's now playing that James White role. But he's also playing the Gillislee goal line back role. So over the last 5 weeks of the season, he ranks 7th among running backs in actual fantasy points per game, 10th in expected fantasy points per game. Far better than I had expected, just given the fact that he's seen just 10 carries per game and 3.8 targets per game over the past 4 weeks. That's not good at all. But he ranks top 5 in opportunities inside the 5 and 10 yard lines over that stretch, and efficiency has been fantastic. Maybe somewhat unsustainable, but I've been saying that for a few weeks now. He's converted on 5 of his 13 red zone opportunities over that span. Deion Lewis has just 2 opportunities inside the 5-yard line this entire season, and the matchup looks good as well. All right, Tyler, good takes all around. Like I said, I think this is a week to pay down. Also want to give a quick shout-out to Marshawn Lynch. Kansas City ranks 4th worst in rushing fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. He's over 65 rushing yards in 3 straight weeks, went over 100 last week, saw 26 carries, 17 carries the last 2 weeks, as well as 3 targets in both games over that stretch. So he's being used a little bit more. He's a little bit more efficient in recent weeks. And the matchup's decent, so did want to mention him briefly. But like I said, this week, just in general, it's kind of rough. There's a lot of good games. A lot of the best teams for fantasy are off the main slate. And I do think it's a week to pay down at the running back position. But there are a few more wide receivers I like than running backs this week. Again, another reason to pay down. Tyler, you want to start us off with the guy at the top who I think we're going to be in agreement and should spend some time debating this, and that is Joshua Caleb Gordon.
The one and only, man. So we said it last week that we wanted to see him do it before we actually paid up for him doing it. And he checked every single box last week in the process. He ended up with a 4 for 85 stat line, 11 targets. He was an integral part of the game plan. We weren't really sure if Hugh Jackson was just paying lip service to that, but man, Gordon lived up to every billing that was but Gordon really lived up to the billing there. He had 210 air yards on 11 targets. He faced tough coverage from Casey Hayward all day, and he still thrived whenever Kaiser was able to throw him a catchable ball. After drawing one of the more difficult matchups on paper in his debut, Gordon now finds himself in a cupcake matchup here against the Packers cornerbacks. Gordon moved all over the formation last week, and until we get more data, I think it's safe to presume that that's how the Browns plan on deploying him, all over the formation and just attacking every corner. Fortunately for the Packers, they have 3 very poor ones. Devon House, Demarius Randall, and Kevin King all rank 77th or worse, King being the lowest at 109 of 115 qualifying corners. I'm expecting Gordon to just have a field day here against the Packers no matter where he lines up. He should completely eat. He's priced far too low at 5,500. The one note I'll make is I'm not normally one to be concerned about weather. It's Wednesday, but I'm already seeing that it's going to be 26 degrees, winds around 18 to 20 miles per hour. 20 is what normally perks up my ears to see is something going to happen or not. So I'm just going to monitor this. But for now, Gordon is 100% in every single one of my lineups this week. I can't fathom building a lineup without him.
All right, so I'm going to repeat some of the things you just said, so apologies to the listeners at home. But so he ranked 6th last week among wide receivers in expected fantasy points, 11 targets, 5 deep targets, 205 yards in the air, 34.3 target market share, all of this ranking top 7 among running backs last week. Basically, 35-month absence, comes back, immediately locked into a mid-range wide receiver 1 workload. That's fantastic, best case scenario for sure. But the efficiency was poor. At least he didn't score a ton of fantasy points, or so you might think. He graded out as our 9th highest graded wide receiver via the pass last week. His 85 receiving yards was the 2nd most Los Angeles has allowed to any wide receiver this season, the 2nd most by any Browns wide receiver in any game this season. He ran 71% of his routes against Casey Hayward, catching 76 of his 85 yards against him. That's notable because Hayward is our highest graded cornerback this season. He hasn't allowed a wide receiver to top 80 yards against him in any game over the past 2 seasons. Again, he had 76 yards against him. Earlier Wednesday, talking to Casey Hayward on Sirius XM NFL Radio, he said that Josh Gordon has been his toughest matchup all year. That is important to note because Casey Hayward has shadowed some of the league's best names. That's including guys like Emmanuel Sanders, Demaryius Thomas, Alshon Jeffrey, Amari Cooper, Michael Crabtree, Demaryius Thomas, and Dez Bryant this season. And then the matchup's amazing. Green Bay is allowing the second most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers, the third most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones. But here's the issue. Everyone is going to play him this week. He's going to be easily the highest owned wide receiver. Tyler, you are one of the most contrarian DFS players I know. You've made a ton of money on that. You brought up the weather. It's really hard to find another reason to fade him outside of that, because I do think he's going to smash his point per dollar expectation. I don't know. You're not even going to get cute and try and be contrarian here if the weather's good.
So my way to play it is I'm either going all in or complete fade. I'm going 100% Josh Gordon. Two websites that I strongly respect their projections are Fantasy Labs and Roto-Grinders. Labs has Gordon projected for 31 to 40% ownership. Roto-Grinders has him at 35, right in the middle there. So they're both expecting him. That's both the top wide receiver projection of the week.
What's Corey Coleman at?
Probably 4. I have no idea. It's amazing Coleman went catchless last week. Gordon, though, I think you have to make a stand. Are you going heavy on him or not? Because if we're going to see 35 to 40% of the public playing Gordon, you either want to go way overboard on him or, I don't know, sprinkle a few hedges or go next to nothing.
Yeah, for those of you who have been, following my work for a while, I used to run the Contrarian GPP article where I talk about ways to fade the chalk, unique roster construction, low-owned guys I'm interested in, but I'm way more of I'm way less of a contrarian devotee than I was last season, and that's because we lost Thursday night ownership percentages, which was huge for me, just having that level of confidence in where guys are going to wind up come Sunday. That was massive for me, but really I just like playing what I think is the best lineup and not getting too cute and worrying about that, because whenever I do, it comes back to haunt me. So I honestly, I'm probably going to have massive exposure to Josh Gordon. And
I'll say one leverage play that I think is a little interesting is going to Duke Johnson. The Packers are not very good at defending the run. They're, I think, top 10 in most rushing yards. They're top 10 in most receiving yards out of the backs. I think it's an exploitable way to go to via Duke. He burned a ton of people last week. I don't think a lot of people will go back to him. I'd rather pivot to Duke than go to a guy like Corey Coleman, considering what we just saw last week.
Interesting. Moving on, the next wide receiver on my list, usually I don't do this in order, but right now this is DeAndre Hopkins. It just leads all wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game. San Francisco has no one to cover him. The end. That's exactly what I wrote up.
I didn't even write anything up because it's just a slam dunk play. Double-digit targets every week. I mean, he's like their only receiver that's healthy at this current junction. Yeah, there's nothing else to add there. He's in a great spot here. Great pace of play for the game. Fire him up.
Beautiful. What about Dez Bryant? Giants are going to be without Janoris Jenkins. Maybe Eli Apple plays, but even if he does, that's not a downgrade to Dez Bryant by any stretch. I honestly think Ross Cockrell is better than Eli Apple. But he's a guy who is seeing a ton of volume. He ranks 5th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game, 16.3, but he's averaging 12.7 actual fantasy points per game. Super inefficient this season. One of the league's least efficient players. The matchup's good, but that hasn't been relevant all season as much as I wanted it to be earlier in the year with some of the work I did in the offseason. But yeah, it just doesn't matter for Dez Bryant. Dak Prescott stealing with a bruised hand. I don't know how I feel about this. What do you think, Tyler?
I think he's in play. I'm still trying to work on my ownership percentages, but I think he's a strong play this week. Thursday he came off, I think it was a 5-catch, 60 plus yard outing with a touchdown. I don't know. He's in play for me. I'm just not sure how much exposure I want. I'm trying to look at another guy I'd like at a similar price point, and a guy that I'm finding a very hard time fading, and it's kind of surprising to me at this point in the year, is Larry Fitzgerald. He's a little bit higher priced on DK up at 6,500, but over the past month, he's averaging 10.5 targets per game. He's reached 24 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4, and that lone miss was against the Jaguars. He and Blaine Gabbert have had an outstanding rapport as of late, and it's something they should turn to frequently again this week here against the Titans. I think Fitz is just a smash play. Slot cornerback Logan Ryan's supposedly going to sit. He suffered a concussion last week. DNP on Wednesday. He's very doubtful to play at the time of this pod. I think Fitzgerald's going to be chalk, but I'm prepared to eat it because I think he's going to be one of my highest owned receivers.
I'm with you. I typically try to avoid wide receivers this old in DFS, just because typically we see a second half decline from these sort of players. I don't think that matters with Larry Fitzgerald. Dude's just a complete and utter freak of nature. Like you said, the matchup's good. Tennessee's allowing the second most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones. His expected fantasy point per game volume has been great, top 10, and it's been improving. It's been better over the last 5 weeks, and even with the quarterback changes that we've seen, I'm on that as well. Also looking at, all right, what do we do with Marvin Jones and Golden Tate? I wish I knew Matthew Stafford was 100% healthy. He is not. He's dealing with that bad risk. He's legitimately questionable, and that's a concern for sure. Otherwise, the matchup's great for both. Tampa Bay is allowing the most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones, second most to wide receivers on deep passes. They rank bottom 3 in fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. All that looks good for Marvin Jones, as well as a model I created that kind of looks like at where a wide receiver is most frequently targeted and where a defense is most vulnerable based on depth and direction. So like short left, intermediate right, deep middle targets. Marvin Jones just popped off as the top play in my model by far. But then Golden Tate, he's in the slot. Tampa Bay is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. These are all reasons to play some Matthew Stafford dub stack lineups as well. If we knew he was healthy, maybe he doesn't even play. Maybe we're dealing with who is it, Jake Rudock?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do we do here, Tyler?
So it's like you said, I have 5 words written down for these two guys combined. Completely contingent on Stafford playing. I can't play.
You're not making any Jake Rudock lineups?
No, so if Rudock were to play, I think I would instead go with a Kenny Galladay, just single bullet by himself, no stacks. Over the last 3 weeks, Galladay's seen 61%, 75%, and 79% of the snaps. He's slowly getting up there as far as taking over that slot or the third receiver spot over TJ Logan. We saw some rapport with him in the preseason between the two of them, where Galladay had that, I think it was a 2-touchdown game when like week 1 or week 2 of the preseason. Everyone dubbed him the next Babytron or whatever, what have you. And like you said, I wish we had more information on Stafford. It completely hinges on his health, how many Lions you want to go and which direction you want to go with it. I'm taking the easy way out. I really don't have a strong answer here until we find out which way to go with Stafford.
Don't you wish you could just predict the future? Like every day, I mean, there's so many people I've wronged throughout my life, mistakes I've made, but I just dream about going back in time like just a week to make some dank DFS lineups with Alex Smith, Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill in Week 13, 2017. The fact is we just don't know right now. We're not going to know for a while, but just know that those guys are in good matchups and super dependent on the health of Matthew Stafford. I'm also looking at Michael Crabtree this week. Amari Cooper is is out of the concussion protocol, but dealing with an ankle injury. Jared Cook is terrible, and there's no Marcus Peters. That some people have argued that's not really a boost. Some people have said Marcus Peters has sucked in recent weeks. That's not true at all. He gave up one 50-yard pass, I think, 5 weeks ago. But outside of that has been fantastic, and he's just not seeing volume, which is another representation of how good a cornerback is. It's not just per target efficiency, but you have to look at how frequently they are targeted on a percentage of their routes. Like that, when quarterbacks are avoiding a guy, that means he's good. And Marcus Peters is really good. Crabtree probably only would have seen him on like 20% of his routes and would have just been targeted more heavily on those routes where he was running away from Peters. But I do think this is a slight upgrade for him. I like him quite a bit. Kansas City's been vulnerable all season, deep in the end zone, and especially recently. Tyler, what do you have to add there?
Love it. Love the call, especially if Amari Cooper were to miss with that lingering ankle injury. Cooper's got a 22% target market share so far in the year. Imagine seeing all those go to Crabtree. We just saw last week both Robbie Anderson and Jermaine Kearse hang 100 yards on him. I'm super into this play. All right, another guy that I really like this week, I kind of mentioned him already, Marquise Goodwin, 5,100. If you haven't noticed, he's quietly putting together a very nice string of games. He's complementing both big plays with an uptick in receptions. He's picked up 68 yards or more in 4 straight outings. He's also just one of 22 wide receivers with over 1,000 air yards so far this season. He has 5 receptions of 40-plus yards. That trails only Tyreek Hill, T.Y. Hilton, and Brandon Cooks. We saw last week that Goodwin was a more integral part of the offense with Jimmy G under center. He caught all 8 of his targets for 99 yards. But what I'm really expecting here is Goodwin to complement both those short to intermediate targets with a couple of big plays over the top. Goodwin has 4.27 speed. I think it's a great chance to utilize that here against the heavy-footed Kevin Johnson, who runs a 4.52 40. Houston is no stranger to getting beat for deep balls down the middle. And I'm really expecting Kyle Shanahan to test that a time or two here with Goodwin this week. I think he's a very strong GPP play.
I am so with you, man. Like I said, I'm all over Jimmy Garoppolo this week, and the matchup presents itself really well for Goodwin, who actually overcame one of the toughest matchups last week. He runs a high percentage of his routes from the left, and Chicago was allowing not the fewest, but the fewest percentage of their wide receiver fantasy points to left wide receivers. So that's encouraging, and this match was far better. Houston's giving up the 4th most deep fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we know how they like to use Goodwin. I also think he's just underrated as a talent, at least this season. I'm also looking at Sammy Watkins with Cooper Kupp in the far more difficult matchup in the slot against Philadelphia. They're allowing bottom 3 fewest fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers, and Patrick Robinson has been a top 5 graded cornerback this season. And Philadelphia is allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers, which is where we know Sammy Watkins runs the far majority of his routes. So I like him this week. I'm also on Deshaun Jackson, who is just far too cheap. Detroit's giving up the 2nd most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver 2s this season. And we know why that is. That's because Darius Slay is one of the league's best shutdown cornerbacks. He will be on Mike Evans. And Detroit's also giving up the 4th most plays of 30 or more yards. We know that's Deshaun Jackson's bread and butter, the big play. He's also seen a very valuable role for fantasy when looking at expected fantasy points. It's been an inconsistent role, but it's been a valuable role for tournaments. He's had 7 games with at least 14 point something expected fantasy points. And then his other 5 games was between 6 and 9. A little inconsistent in terms of workload, but payoff could be there for tournaments, although we haven't really seen a big ceiling from him all season. I do believe it's coming. Any interest in Deshaun Jackson or Sammy Watkins?
Yeah, Sammy Watkins was the guy I wrote up as well, so I'm not surprised at all that you mentioned him here. I really like, without Robert Woods again, what should be an easy matchup here for Watkins against Jalen Mills. The Jared Goff, Sammy Watkins connection is producing the 4th highest QB rating in the league so far this season, 126.9. The two are just thriving when they're targeting each other. Think he's a very low-owned GPP play that should go off. And I really like the Deshaun Jackson call too. Hadn't really thought of it that much. But you're right. We're going to see a lot of Slay on Mike Evans. The only problem with Deshaun Jackson is he hasn't had those big plays going for scores that we're used to seeing. Hopefully this is the week he turns it around. We saw last week that what's his name? Sorry. We saw last week that Jameis Winston was getting back into the rhythm of things. It looked pretty good. I'm expecting him to look even better this week here against Detroit. I'll just add one last name that I'm kind of interested into, and it's Danny Amendola at 5K. He's on the Monday night slate, so it's kind of hard to get to him. But you had referenced it earlier. He saw a season high 8 receptions when Gronk missed the game, and I think he's just a really great play here. Any other wide receivers you'd like to touch on before we hit the tight end position?
Yeah, there are a few more ancillary plays for me, guys, in pseudo good matchups. Could see more volume. AJ Green, Stephon Diggs, Zay Jones, JJ Nelson, Jamison Crowder, Sterling Shepard. All those guys are in good to great matchups. But we can move on to the tight end position. I know we're already running a little late here. Tyler, who are you looking at at the top at the tight end position?
It's got to be Travis Kelce. I mean, I mentioned him as a great GPP play last week and a nice pivot off Gronk. And Kelce came through with flying colors. He had 25.4 DraftKings points. He was featured in the winning lineup of both DK's Millie Maker and FanDuel Sunday Million contest. Kelce draws another favorable matchup here against the Raiders. He put up a modest 4-catch, 33-yard, and 1 touchdown stat line against them in their previous matchup. But I'm pretty excited to see how offensive coordinator Matt Nagy builds off last week's passing success against the Jets. Kelce started red hot with an early 390 and 2 stat line. That happened before most people had finished up setting up chips and dip for Sunday football. But he was pretty quiet after that. He saw, I think, just 5 more targets on the day, catching one of them for 4 yards. I'm hoping to see a little more consistency out of Nagy, featuring Kelce in the game plan. Oakland's pass defense should allow them to build on that success. They rank top 10 in most receptions and receiving yards allowed to opposing tight ends. I think if you're paying up at the position, Kelce's the way to go.
I am with you on Travis Kelce. He's averaging 16.1 expected fantasy points per game over his last 5 games. Not only is that best among all tight ends by a landslide, that would rank 11th among all receivers. So though he is the highest priced tight end on DraftKings this week, he is still actually kind of a value in terms of recent volume, with an added boost considering Gronkowski is not on the main slate and not playing. Jimmy Graham, though, is actually one of my top volume per dollar values on DraftKings. So he ranks 3rd among tight ends in expected fantasy points per game both the last 5 weeks and the season. He's the 6th most expensive tight end on DraftKings. He's just $5,000. Really only a tournament play because you're banking so much on touchdowns. For the past 4 or 5 weeks, I think we've ranted about the insane workload he's seeing near the end zone. Basically, if the Seahawks score a touchdown, it's like a 60% chance Jimmy Graham is catching it. And in theory, the Jacksonville defense is sort of tight end funnelish like Denver. They're allowing the fewest fantasy points per game, the fewest fantasy points per target to both outside and slot wide receivers. Would make more sense to attack them via the tight end, but they have been good or at least average to tight ends this season.
Man, they've been pretty good against tight ends. The only guy who's really had success is rookie Seals Jones, which